Hi everyone, and happy Wednesday! My video this week is inspired by some very special things that I love. First and foremost, it was inspired by my sister. She just celebrated her birthday, and I guess because she celebrated a birthday, I've been thinking about her a little bit more than usual. Not that I don't often think of my sister, but she's been on my mind quite a bit. So I've been thinking about her, and I guess that sort of sparked the idea for me to paint a sunflower. And the reason for that is that she used to love sunflowers. And I don't know if she loved them quite as much anymore as she used to, because I think my mom and I just, she loved sunflowers. So anytime we see anything sunflower related, we would think of her and we would buy it for her. And I think at some point we might have given her so many things relating to sunflowers that she may not really like them as much as she used to. But whenever I see a sunflower, I think of my sister. And so I felt inspired to paint a sunflower because I was thinking of her on her birthday, and I love painting sunflowers. I love planting sunflowers. I love sunflowers. They're very beautiful. That doesn't mean I want to cover my whole entire house with sunflowers. That may have been part of why she might have grown sick of them. But yeah, I love sunflowers and they make me think of my sister, so I wanted to paint one this week. I'm going to paint one using watercolors, of course, and I'm also going to be using some watercolor ground because I want it to be a textured sunflower, and I am not 100% sure how it's going to go because, of course, I'm painting it over watercolor paper, and sometimes if I add a lot of medium over the paper, it can make the paper buckle more. So fingers crossed it will work out. But yeah, that's where the whole inspiration for this painting started. And then, of course, gardening season is right around the corner, and I'm a gardener. I love gardening. I love planting flowers. I love everything about the outdoors. So this is a pretty special time of the year for me as well. Sunflowers are not going to be anywhere near blooming, so I thought I'd make one bloom in my studio. So I won't keep you any longer. I'll start getting the process going. I want to say a huge thank you for being here, and I also want to say thank you for all the wonderful ways you connect with me every week. I get the most wonderful messages from people from all over the world, and it's very special, and it's so meaningful to me. And I don't think I'd still be doing this, honestly, if it weren't for the fact that I can connect the way I connect with so many of you. So thank you for that. Thank you for being here with me, and I hope you enjoy this week's video. I started my process off by cutting my watercolor paper to 9 by 9 inches. Then I taped it to my plexiglass. And now I'm in the process of figuring out where the center or relative center of my paper is so that I can draw two circles, one smaller than the other. And that's gonna serve for me as a guide as to where I'm gonna put my petals. Then I've pulled out my watercolor ground and a palette knife, and I pulled out a palette knife that is pointy because I want to use it to create some petals. And I think it's important that it is a palette knife that is pointy like this, otherwise I don't think it'll work quite the same way. So I'm working directly from my watercolor ground container, and I'm applying a lot of it to the surface of my paper to create my flower. I'm not going to show you the whole entire thing. You basically, I think, can get the gist of what I'm doing. I'm just putting some watercolor ground on my palette knife, and then I'm smushing, and as I'm smushing it down, I am pulling my knife backwards. Once I completed my first set of petals, which was basically lined up with the largest of my circles, I then go inside to work using the guide of the smaller circle, and I go in between the first petals that I created with my watercolor ground, and I start to add more petals on the inside because I want to have my petals sort of be layered one on top of each other, sort of the same way as an actual sunflower would be. Now, this should look in the end like a sunflower, but you know me, I don't tend to work in realism quite a bit, so it's mostly usually abstract what I do, but I do want there to be a resemblance to a sunflower. So of course it's going to be important for me to try and replicate as much as possible what an actual sunflower looks like. But I'm not putting any pressure on myself for this to be perfect. Pressure tends to make the process less fun, and that's the last thing I want to do. I want to have fun with this process, and I hope that I can encourage you to do the same thing. I'm done working on my petals at this point, but they are still wet, and I want to add some little art stones to the center of my flower. So I have to be very careful not to touch the petals, otherwise they will get disturbed by any movement I make touching them, because again the medium is still wet, so it's important to be careful here. So I'll do the same thing when I'm adding my art stones. I'll put some on, sprinkle some on in the center of the flower. But again, I'm trying to work carefully so that I don't disturb the petals. And yeah, I really like the shapes that I created with my petals. So I don't want to ruin what I've already done. But if something were to happen, I'm going to do my best to just roll with it and figure something out along the way. As I work very intuitively, I've made a decision here that I'm not 100% sure I would recommend. I've decided to add a tiny bit of color in the background in order to get the process sort of going with my flower because I don't want to leave that wet. I think in hindsight, it might have been a little bit better for me to wait until the sunflower was fully dry in order to do this. Then I wouldn't have potentially risked doing damage to my petals, but I decided to do it anyway, and it worked out for me in the end. But I would suggest if you're going to do this to be very, very careful and probably to work with a smaller brush than the one I'm working with.
But you know, it's always worth trying something, and I tried it and it seemed to work out at least somewhat. So there's, nothing went wrong by me doing this, but there was potential for some little mishaps here. So if you can be a little bit more patient than I was, I would definitely recommend waiting until your flower is dry if you're going to do this. Otherwise, you know, I wasn't all that patient and I went ahead and added color and it wasn't all that big of a deal anyway. So I'll let you decide what you think is best for your painting. Maybe one of the reasons I wanted to do this was that I didn't want to have the only section of the paper that was wet be the area where the flower was. And I thought that maybe by adding some color and paint and water over the rest of the paper that it would help to prevent it from buckling as much. Um, I don't know that that was necessarily the case, but like I said, no harm, no foul, no harm came to my flower by me doing this. So it ended up being okay. It was just a little bit harder because I had to be very careful as I was adding paint. In all of the areas where there's maybe a little bit more water pooling on my paper, I've decided to add some granules of coarse grained salt because that will typically help to absorb some of that water a little bit better than if I just went in with some fine grained salt. And after I'm done doing that, I'm going to carefully come in with some fine grained salt as well, and I'll add some around my flower. But I'm going to be very careful not to add it over my flower because if I add any salt over my flower at this point, I will not be able to take it off later. At this point, everything is now dry, including the flowers. So I'm coming in with an old plastic card and I'm removing or scraping off the salt that is on the paper around my flower. And again, I'm being very careful not to touch the petals. They are dry at this point, but I think this watercolor ground is still somewhat fragile and I wouldn't want to accidentally break some of the petals. After I did that, as you can see, I started adding some color to my petals and I'm starting with the lightest color first because I want to be able to add darker colors on top. And if you start with the opposite, it's often, well, actually, it's not impossible, but it's more difficult to lighten things up. And so I start with my lightest color of yellow, and then I'll slowly but surely work on adding darker colors on top as I keep going along. But before I do that, I will definitely let things dry. Here I've decided to take a bit of a risk and I'm going to add some Van Dyke Brown to the center of my flower while everything is still wet. Now, because everything is still wet, I want you to be fully aware that if you do this, there is a chance that this dark paint will spread to some parts of the petals. It's very possible. I'm not 100% sure. And yep, it sure did. For me, this is not overly concerning. In fact, it's a little bit of a desired effect for me because what it does is it darkens the bottom parts of the petals. And I'm going to be coming in with some more color and adding color on top of that. You'll still see some of that darker color through the watercolor because, of course, watercolors are transparent. But it shouldn't be too much of a distraction because I do think that it will add to the petals more so than anything else. But that it's just something to be mindful of if you're working with watercolors, especially if you're working wet on wet. Color will not just stick to that one area where you're adding it. It will travel because water sort of has a mind of its own, which makes it a very wonderful medium to work with, but it's important to be aware of how it works in order to not have any surprises that you may not want. I want to work on darkening the center of my sunflower, but I don't want the color to spread as much as it did the first time I added color there. So I let the whole sunflower or the petals of my sunflower dry first. And now I'm coming in with some water and I'm just adding it over the center portion of the painting. And I'm going to start adding color there. And because that's the only area of the painting that's currently wet, the color will not travel as much as it did the first time. I've decided to darken the center of the flower a little bit more, but in hindsight, I think I liked it more before I did this. So I'll have to sort of work around sort of a fix for this. And really, if I wanted to, I probably could just take a piece of paper towel and wipe it off relatively easily, or I could even sprinkle some water on top, and I'm sure it would make the color come off those little art stones, and then I'd be left with some lighter stones in the area. But I did it, so I'm gonna just keep working with it, and I have some ideas as to how I could make it look a little bit different and quote unquote better for me. So I'll just keep working at it because that's sort of what my intuition called me to do, and I did it. And so now I want to see how I can transform this area of the painting as I keep moving along. To add a little bit more dimension to my petals, I have decided to come in with some quinacridone burnt orange. And this is going to add some color contrast, and it's also um, gonna make the textures stand out a little bit more. So I'm happy with this decision. Sort of wish the paint hadn't spread out on the exterior parts of my flower as much as it has. But I am gonna find a way to make that work in my favor as well. And so I'm just gonna keep going, and I'm gonna keep doing what I'm doing right now because I do really love adding this to the flower. I think it does make the petals stand out more, and it's gonna add some more dimension to the petals and make all those wonderful textures created with my palette knife stand out. Everything's looking a little bit darker right now than what I'd actually like it to look, but I know that when watercolor dries, it dries lighter. And so I know once it's dried, it's going to look different. And so I'm just continuing to do what I'm doing, trusting in the fact that it will all turn out the way I want it to turn out in the end. And sometimes it's really hard to trust, that things are going to turn out because if we really have our hearts set on something turning out a certain way, then it can be hard to let go of that control and to just trust. But I do my best when I'm painting not to try and control everything that's happening as much as possible because that keeps my process a lot more free and it flows better. And I also don't prevent myself from experimenting and trying things that sometimes work out, things that sometimes do not work out, but every single time I learn something about the process and how to work through different issues. And so it's important for me to give myself that permission to try things and to do things differently. So I didn't really like how the paint had spread out near my petals. I felt like it was a little bit too orange outside the petals, and it was blending into my sky a little bit more. So I'm coming in with my brush and I'm sort of scrubbing that color around the petals a little bit with my brush to try and um, rub off these like hard marks left by the color. and I'm trying to add more blue. Now, the orange and the yellow mixed with the blue are going to turn a little greenish, and I am choosing to be okay with this. Again, as I'm working along, I am noticing these things, and my creative intuition is kicking in, and it's giving me some suggestions for things I might be able to do to help remediate these areas. But it's watercolor, it's not an actual real flower. I'm giving myself permission to experiment and to keep painting, and I'm really, like I said before, choosing to trust in my ability to get through whatever issues come up. To me, this is already starting to look a little bit better, but I want to push it a little bit more. I want the blue around my sunflower to be a little bit more vibrant. And so I've decided to play with a color that I don't use very frequently, and that is uh, French ultramarine, I think it's called. I'll have the name of it, of course, in my video description, but it's not a blue that I work with very frequently, but I think in this case it will help me to sort of bring things back a little bit more. And so I've decided to add it. It's going to darken my sky. My sky might have looked quote unquote better if it had remained lighter, but I'm not worried about it again because as everything dries, things will lighten up. That's just the way watercolors work. And to help things along, once I'm done applying the color, I'm also going to come in with some fine grained salt, and that's going to help lift some of that paint, and I think it will create some interesting effects for the sky around my sunflower. Okay, so everything is dry again, and I've removed all the salt from my paper, and now I'm going to work on giving my flower a stem. And as you may or may not know, sunflowers have a pretty thick stem. They really need to have a pretty thick stem because they have such a big flower head that they need something sturdy to hold that flower up. So I'm not doing anything crazy. I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible, so I'm drawing a very simple leaf shape and a very simple stem, and I am calling it good. I'm not gonna stress about it. I'm actually gonna tell you that I'm super pleasantly surprised at how well everything has dried so far. And I'm pleasantly surprised at the fact that the paper is still not all that much buckled, considering how much it's gone through at this point. So having the paper tape down has really helped. But I will say this, what you're seeing here happening relatively quickly on YouTube did not happen so quickly in my studio. I started this painting 2 days before actually getting to this part of the process. So I have allowed for a lot of drying time to make sure that my medium was fully dried, because when you keep adding water to paper that's buckled, if you don't give it time to dry properly, it will continue to buckle, and sometimes it's really hard for you to bring it back. And on a painting like this, where there's texture over the paper, you can't easily unbuckle the paper after the fact. So you kind of need to make sure you allow the paper enough time to dry to prevent as much buckling of the paper as possible. One of the things I've decided to do with the center part of my painting or my flower is to add a little bit of shimmery bronze paint to my art stones, and that's going to help the light catch that area and it will make my art stone stand out a little bit more. And so that's going to change how this area looks. I was finding it a little bit too dark and sort of very matte, and I think this shimmery paint will help that along. I've also decided to add some dotting using some black ink and my dotting tool, and I'll add that somewhat around the center of the flower in order to again create more dimension and value contrast. Some of the most beautiful sunflowers I've ever seen are taller than me, and they stand so tall that you have to look up at them. And when you're looking up at them, if the sun is behind them, they sort of seem to have this halo around them and they almost seem to glow. And so intuitively, I thought, you know what? I'm not crazy about the fact that the paint has spread around the flower. So I'll use my white pen to create some little white dots around the flower, and that will be sort of to replicate, or not really replicate, but give the impression that the flower is glowing in the sunlight. Another trick I can use to make my petals look like they are somewhat glowing with the light of the sun behind them is to add some gold to my flower petals. And I don't want to add the gold everywhere. I'm really going to try to stick to adding that gold to the raised textures of the petals. And in order to do this, I'm just going to use my brush sideways and I'm just going to brush gently over the areas that are more raised on the flower. No matter how many times I use gold, it really never ceases to impress me. I mean, just adding a little bit of gold, I really feel has helped change this flower. And it was, I thought, beautiful before, but it really seems that this gold is helping the petals stand out even more. And yeah, it's exciting when you have a tool in your um, creative supplies that can help you do something like this. I really love it. And it's funny too because I am really not a person who wears a lot of jewelry, so I've never really had a lot of gold jewelry or anything like that in my life. In fact, if I were to buy jewelry, I'd probably prefer to buy silver. But I love to paint with gold. I just love it. Can't get enough of it. And since I can't get enough of it, I've decided to add a little bit of this green gold to my flower stem and also to my leaf. And I think that's going to be it. I think once I've done this, I probably will be very close to calling the painting done. But sometimes I need to pull that tape off the paper to see if I really feel like I'm done or not. So we'll see. And as soon as I start to remove that tape, I know it is done. Cleaning up the edges is just the last thing this painting needed, and I'm really ready to call it complete. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this on a number of occasions, but I do love working with texture. There's something about adding texture to a painting that just makes it extra special. It almost makes you want to reach out and touch it, which I know is not necessarily a good thing to want to do with art. But I love how when you look at it, you can really get the sense that there are petals up over other petals, and the flower just seems to come to life more for me for that reason. So I really enjoyed creating this little painting. I love that it was inspired to me by someone I love very dearly, my sister, and our shared appreciation for sunflowers. And before I even started adding color to this painting, I could already see all the possibilities for creating other types of flowers using this technique with the watercolor ground. So I hope you're feeling inspired to use this type of texture medium to create your own little garden of flowers. Thank you again for making the time to join me on my creative journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating!